So this is going to be kind of rehashing some of the things I've already done. So if you're recognizing some things, that's why. But I'm preparing actually a lecture for a conference, and so I'm kind of using this as a way to get a little practice. Okay. Consumer aesthetics, consumer art, Oscar Wilde, J.R.R. Tolkien. Let's go to my PowerPoint and let's see if I can get this thing to work. And so I am walking through a text first from Oscar Wilde that I've done before, which is his play, An Ideal Husband, where we see the following dialogue. And sorry, how do I hide this thing? Okay, there we go. Where Sir Robert Chiltern is going to be blackmailed by Mrs. Cheveley. She's coming back to London. She has the dirt on him. He committed a crime earlier in his life, and she has the dirt. But before that, she's talking to him about the woman of fashion, the mondaine, the well-dressed philosopher that Wilde tended to write about and that they tended to embody. And it says this. Sir Robert says, you prefer being natural. Sometimes, but it is such a very difficult pose to keep up. What would those modern psychological novelists, of whom we hear so much, say to such a theory as that? The strength of women comes from the fact that psychology cannot explain us. Men can be analyzed, women merely adored. You think science cannot grapple with the problem of women? Science can never grapple with the irrational. That is why it has no future before it in this world. And women represent the irrational. Well-dressed women do. So a lot has been said about this dialogue, and we'll get back to this in a minute, but just thinking about how Wilde and these consumer aesthetes, these consumer artists are writing about how the woman of fashion, the sex symbol even, represents the irrational, the unconscious, the Dionysian aspect, the mythopoeic aspect of culture, the culture generating aspect, the poetic legislators of the world that Shelley wrote about. And so there's a lot going on here. And let's think about it in terms of Weber's disenchantment concept. And he says here in his Science as a Vocation essay, the savage knows what he does in order to get his daily food, and which institutions serve him in this pursuit. Notice this says savage. Anyway, hence it means that principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can in principle master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. So I want to just mark this really briefly, but he marks the world as disenchanted, that it had previously been enchanted, that we could access mysterious, incalculable forces. But now those things are gone because we can just calculate everything. Everything's accessible to science and technology, he thinks. So we've just mastered everything, and it's those savages who were like benighted, clueless fools who thought that there were these mysterious powers. And what I'm saying is that Tolkien and Wilde are delving into those enchanted powers. And they're doing a secular re-enchantment of culture, that they're delving into, or they're touching anyway, these mythoi, these mythic stories, which are identity forming, which touch the matters of ultimate concern, the maps that allow us to find meaning in the world. These are going against both Marxists and Christian and other thinkers, Marxists like Althusser or Marx himself, or Michel Foucault, or Christians like T.S. Eliot or Wendell Berry, who see this modern consumerism as inherently corrosive of artistic work and destructive, and that we are hard pressed to really be able to build anything meaningful and powerful and really good in that consumer culture world. And yet Wilde and Tolkien did just that. And with their consumer aesthetics, they re-enchant the world from within that commercialized society. They channel the mechanisms of culture building, which were seen as superficial, in the mall, on Amazon.com, and they say, I buy, therefore I am. I form myself through the liturgies of consumption and consuming that I partake of. And so let's look at the next picture here. On enchantment, and let me try and walk through this chart that's kind of complicated. And on the left side, we have the extreme of disenchantment, of getting rid of magic and story and the mythoi, the enchanted myths that give color and shape and pattern to the world. And on the right side, you have the extreme enchantment, like where there's totally chock full of stories and like you're just exploding with too many stories, and it becomes schizophrenic, even to the point of insanity. And then I got these kind of middle parts on this spectrum, and I've starred the enchantment part because I think that's the part that I think is the sweet spot in the middle, that is where Wilde and Tolkien are doing their work. But let's start on the left side, the extreme disenchantment, which maybe we can say Weber was sort of pointing towards, where there is no narrative. That these are all lies. All these stories are lies. They're like power grabs by Nietzschean will to power wielders, and that computation, what we can calculate and factually and empirically verify is all that is real. Anything else than that is a lie. It's someone trying to sell you a bill of goods, and you've got to like totally distrust and be suspicious of that. And I'm putting here, I don't want to make fun of autistic people, I would never do that, but the autistic person, the Schneider in Merleau-Ponty's work is in some ways similar to this, where they have a hard time seeing narratives. They have a hard time seeing the gist of things. When Schneider saw the pen that's held up to him, he says, oh, that's a cylindrical, blue-colored object. I mean, he couldn't see the whole big picture. He could only see the parts. He could only see the details. He can't see the story. He can't see the pattern. Or what's the line from James K.A. Smith, that Schneider could do his homework in a strip club because he wouldn't tell what's going on. He would just say, okay, that person's kind of taking off their shirt, and but he wouldn't like get what was going on. It wouldn't like register. He wouldn't see the story. He wouldn't see the pattern. He would just see like a bunch of facts which were unconnected. So that's the extreme disenchantment, and I'm comparing that to Weberian disenchantment. And anyway, let's go to the common disenchantment, which is more common, and then sort of really maybe that's the dominant culture today, we might say, where we see some mythic and some narrative patterns, and because we see like, okay, there's an environment that we've got to take care of, we that's meaningful, or there's an arc of freedom that we've got to develop, and so when Martin Luther King Jr. says, there's this arc of history, like, yeah, we buy that, like, yeah, there is something progressive in freedom, and it's good that we increase the level of freedom. Now, so there's some examples of this: Marxists who see the narrative of class warfare, libertarians who see the narrative of pure freedom. But overall, there's a general disenchantment where there's still a hermeneutics of suspicion, and the hermeneutics of suspicion refers to people like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who see these narratives as something that we've got to distrust, that they're lies, that they're masking something that's underneath. Let's get to the third column, enchantment, which I think is the sweet spot, which is where these artists are doing their work, and it's very productive work, and that's where I want to be personally, which is where we see matter as suffused with meaning, narrative, consciousness, that mind and matter, consciousness and the material world are continually and always together. And we have access to this through our cognition. We have neurotransmitters in our brain, which are dopaminergically modulated. So dopamine, which gives me a hit and makes me want and love certain things, is helping me perceive those patterns. And this is when I'm having my right hemisphere guiding my left hemisphere. My right hemisphere, which is seeing the big picture, which is seeing the patterns, whereas the left hemisphere, which tends to focus more on just the details, unconnected to patterns, just pieces and parts. Right hemisphere is seeing the whole, seeing the whole. And then if I go too far, though, in that direction, I'm on the right side of this chart, which is the schizophrenic, who is projecting narratives onto reality. It's too extreme. It's gone to the extreme where, for example, John Nash in the film Beautiful Mind is going literally crazy because he is thinking, oh, there's some kind of FBI agent who's telling me to look for patterns in the newspapers, and he's looking for all these patterns in the newspapers. There's some kind of mysterious message there, but no, there was nothing there. So let's get out of that for a second, and just say a few more things about this sweet spot of meaning in the midst of this world where I'm perceiving the world as suffused with meaning. In fact, what I mainly perceive are meanings. I'm not mainly perceiving objects. And I'm going to refer to a psychologist and cognitive scientist, John Vervaeke, who I tend to refer to. He has an article called Rationality and Relevance Realization with Anna Riedel, where he says, and I've said this before, first we have to figure out what's relevant, what to aim at, what's the value, what's the story, what's the frame. And then I can get the object. This is against a logicist or logicist or computationalist view, which again tends towards that quasi-autistic worldview. But I'm looking at the gestalts and I'm seeing the patterns, the wholes, and that's not reducible to details. So then we get to these consumer artists, and let's talk with Wilde first, because he's the more theoretical between Wilde and Tolkien. And he is saying that he and that his characters, who are also kind of consumer artists, do not speak plainly but in a stylized utterance. That's number one. Number two, they see themselves as symbols of their culture, including the symbolic action of conspicuously consuming. So consuming things as part of their art, consuming like buying things. And third, by doing so, they delve into the unconscious, the mythopoeic aspect of human experience. And so getting back to the Mrs. Cheveley and Sir Robert Chiltern discussion there, where he says, so women represent the irrational, and she says, well-dressed women do. The woman of fashion does. The person who's able to channel, make use of these mechanisms within the consumer cultural world is a culture builder. I mean, the most powerful ones are like literally like founders of religions. I mean, Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha engaged in the consumer cultures of their worlds to give a worldview, more than a worldview, give a whole world feel to the people who resonated with their messages. Now that's obviously not what Mrs. Cheveley is doing, but there's something parallel in what she's doing. And then Wilde, I mean, in a certain sense, Wilde uses Jesus Christ as kind of the prototypical artist, the person who creates a fashion, more than a fashion, like a whole lifestyle that inspires and makes people love and makes people want that. And then they create images and reproduce them and they're in all kinds of churches and in your home and in your notebook and so forth. Okay, so let's get back to Mrs. Cheveley. Speaking in the stylized manner, expressing delight, and you know, certain thinkers, especially some Christian thinkers, and I'm a Christian, so I don't want to pick on them too much, but they tend to say expressive individualism is this evil thing that's destroying culture, and you can see it in the consumer world, and there's truth in that. But it's a huge mistake to make a big brush stroke over the whole of consumer culture and over the whole of this expressivism, because this expression and this individualistic expression is part of art and is part of the generation of culture and making great works of art. And so the artist has to do that. That's their duty. And so that's how they kind of channel the zeitgeist, and they're able to kind of create and keep culture going, or as Tolkien would later say, sub-create. So they're participating in the universes, or gods, if you believe in God, God's creating of the world. And so that's number one, speaking in a stylized manner, expressing delight. Secondly, being a symbol and working in symbols against a materialistic empiricist way of thinking, looking at symbolic thinking, standing in symbolic relation to an age, like a sex symbol is standing in symbolic relation to their age, whether that's Marilyn Monroe or Brad Pitt. But then there's also like other type of iconic images of like people who are iconic, like MLK or Gandhi, like people whose lives are these inspiring icons for millions of people and are shaping the culture and are expressing something. And there's something kind of Hegelian about this. I'm not a Hegelian, but I like some of Hegel's ideas in terms of the zeitgeist, this kind of idea that gets expressed in the world through the individuals, that the world's not just a dead set of facts, but there's a geist, there's an intellect, there's a mind, a ghost, geist. And so Goring, Lord Goring, in that play, An Ideal Husband again, when we see him being described, he's described as one who one sees that he stands in immediate relation to modern life, makes it indeed, and so masters it. So his body and his person is like a fractal form that kind of propagates into the world. And like a human body is like a work of architecture. It's not just a dead thing. It is expressive of culture. It's shaping the culture. It's shaping people's behavior and their attitude towards the world. And like whether that's a temple or the World Trade Center, which was destroyed. And like, why was it destroyed? Because of its symbolic status uh, of what it stood for. That's why it was so important to the terrorists to destroy that. It's not just a building, it's not just a bunch of bricks. Same thing with the human body when it's adorned with fashion. When Goring enters the stage in that play, or in the film, if you see the film, well, this is in the play. It describes him in this way. Enter Lord Goring in evening dress with a buttonhole. He is wearing a silk hat and an Inverness cape. White gloved, he carries a Louis XVI cane. His are all the delicate fopperies of fashion. And he's conspicuously consuming. He's showing wealth, power, class, knowledge, style in a peacock fashion that impacts everyone around him. Or, I'm looking at my time here. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So there's other characters in the play who are similarly described as an artist and an artwork, as a kind of work of architecture, so to speak, that's expressive of culture. His fiancée in the play is named Mabel Chiltern. She is kind of the archetype of English beauty, he says. So she's standing in symbolic relation in her way. But, you know, again, this is that expressive individualism that, you know, is Nietzschean in a sense. It's not, I mean, it can be Nietzschean in a total nihilistic sense, but I think it doesn't need to be that way. It can be compatible with a more non-nihilistic view of the world, transcendent view of the world. But a person, an artist, has a duty to express what is within. And George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, who was kind of Nietzschean, talked about the life force, like this kind of like, well, this life-affirming thing. That's Nietzsche. Life-affirming is what Nietzsche would talk about. That culture needs to be life-affirming, not life-denying. Expressing the life, expressing life, expressing the desire for life. That's what happens in Tolkien in his character Tom Bombadil, whose language is like an expression of delight at every moment. And so good. Let's look at Tolkien for a second. Tolkien wrote this poem called Mythopoeia, and mytho like mythos, poeia like a poet or poem, which means make. So the making of myth, the crafting of myth, mythopoeia, making of myth or story. And I'm gonna go back to my PowerPoint and see if I can get this thing to work again. I'm gonna see if I can skip ahead here. Oh, this is, well, let's keep going. Mythopoeia, where Tolkien is what? He's describing the world and how the person perceives the world and names the world and conversates and shares with others about that conversation about the world, that myth about the world. And so in the poem, it says this: there is no firmament, that is the sky, only a void, unless a jeweled tent myth-woven in elf pattern, and no earth, unless the mother's womb whence all have birth. The heart of man is not composed of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. And what's he's saying here? Um, there is no firmament. There's no sky. Oh, there's only a void. Unless I have a myth, unless I have a story which tells me it's a jeweled tent, myth woven and elf patterned. The lines before this say this: He sees no stars who does not see them first of living silver made. He sees no stars who does not see them first of living silver made. And so I can't even see things like stars or the sky unless I have a story, unless I have a myth guiding me, unless I have a desire laden story. I'm not just cogitating. I'm living. I'm desiring. I'm expressing my desire to live, and that's embedded in that myth and that story that I've already taken in. He sees no stars who does not see them first, as living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. Then there is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth woven and elf patterned, and no earth. So, and the heart of man is not compounded of lies. So, like, someone could say, like, oh, that's just a bunch of lies. That's just like a myth. That's fake. You're projecting. And while it is true that people can project, especially when, I mean, you can have mental illness and project, or you can have you're just projecting. But you can't see anything unless you have some myth already within you. Myth woven and elf pattern. The world that you look at is always already myth woven and elf patterned. Story enables cognition. Could I know anything if I had not already drunk in some background story? No. and I've talked about this in other episodes where Helen Keller couldn't know anything really. I mean, she could perceive, but she could sense things, but until she had a word, water, water, she couldn't really think. She couldn't really experience as a human being. And once she had that one word, the world exploded to her. She could see it, she could perceive it, she could relate to it, she could live it meaningfully. And so these are the key ideas I wanted to express today. And yeah, there's a lot here, so I'm going to kind of wind it down and say that Wilde and Tolkien were prescient and could see where the consumer culture was going. Wilde even more so, really, because he was living it. He was swimming in that material culture world, that consumer culture world, and perceiving the mythic patterns, like the quasi-religious quality of consumer culture, that human beings have always had mythic rituals and rituals which were mythologized, sitting in the cave in the dark with the fire and drawings on the cave and the person telling the story, the bard, maybe even singing with music and pounding on a drum. And so we needed those stories, those ritualized stories, just to be able to live and perceive the world and make sense of it. And when the modern world and the Enlightenment tended to say, like, oh, we can just get rid of all the myths, we don't really need that anymore, we starved our minds. We did starve our minds, but we starved our whole bodies, our hearts, our guts of what we need in order to live. And so Wilde, and where did that go? It went into the consumer culture world, because that's where the rituals are, more than in the church or in the mosque. I mean, you can have those, and people do have those, but our common culture, our common rituals, I mean, they're in the state as well, and like in patriotism and in like the flag and in statues, but they're mainly in consumer culture, in the mall, in the movie theater, on Amazon.com, in my iPhone. Like, that's where art happens. and that's where Wilde saw it needed to go, and Tolkien, almost against his will, did it as well. And like his stories, because they were really rooted in the ancient stories, I mean, both Wilde and Tolkien had that, they were able to really channel those, like George Lucas, like J.K. Rowling, like really just using the old stories over again, because they're still there. They're still in our hearts, and they resonate. And so that's where we're going.